killed because they wouldn't deny Jesus, versus those who are standing up for morality?
If I understand your question, the early Christian martyr texts exclude the idea that this was a morality play. If that's what you mean for righteousness' sake, the answer is there is none of that in these texts. We're not talking about a moral code that is here held up. We are told about the fun, and I'll get more to the theological underpinnings of this in just a second. The martyr texts deal with death. Okay? The fundamental issue is, what is it that defines in an absolute sense your identity? A moral code does not do that, nor can it. It is part of the Christian understanding that what constitutes one's person is precisely one's relation. Okay? Not one's obedience to a code, but one's faithfulness to a particular relationship. Okay? And this is why, with some frequency, martyr texts are expressed in baptismal or even Eucharistic language. Okay? And this is why we'll stress the idea of participation. You are not simply standing up for a code, however good it may be. So this is not two moralities. This is conflict. If you have a soldier in battle, okay, you're not asking yourself, am I dealing with a good father here? Right? You kill the guy. Right? And so there is a place in which fundamental, underlying existential truth is in play that cannot simply be expressed by way of good behaviors. Now, there may also be good behaviors, but the fundamental point is that this is a manifestation of the spiritual conflict that Jesus himself was the supreme, and in some sense, the only true warrior. And so it's very commonplace in modern texts, sometimes in one way, one time in another way, where the martyr assumes distinctly Christological character. And this is very typical already of the New Testament. In view of your question, let me go to a biblical text that I was really planning on adducing a little later, but maybe right now is a very good example of this. And I'm thinking of the way Paul, in his letters, depicts himself as apostle. Right? You have your Bible with you by any chance? Okay. Are there some Bibles in the back that maybe some of those could be handed out? Here I'm going to refer to I'm going to refer you to Paul's second letter to the Church of Corinth, which in many ways is an apologia, a defense of his apostolicity. Okay. Now let's just back up a second and indicate for a while what the language of apostolicity means. One of the Jewish, as you may know, apostle comes from the Greek word to send. So an apostle is one who is sent, and he is one sent with the full authority of the sender. Right. And in the ancient world, the one who sent was in every sense seen and heard in the one sent. So the idea of apostolicity structures, for example, John's Gospel, where Jesus will say, "Everything that I have said, I do not say from myself, but what I say has been given me to say by him who sent me. Therefore, he who hears me, hears him who sent me." And likewise, the activities of Jesus. What I do not do from myself. But what I has been given me to do by him who sent me. Therefore, he who sees me, sees him who sent me. Right? That is this fundamental idea of apostolicity, that the apostle is the image of the sender. And so you know the sender by way of the one sent. Okay? Are you following me? And so you have, this was a deeply Jewish idea. Certainly very much characteristic of rabbinic understandings. The disciple was a kind of another image term. The disciple was a mathetes. That is the Greek word for disciple. It comes from the passive of the word to learn. Okay. So the disciple was one who has been taught. And so images the teaching of his master, his rabbi, by way of his own mouth and by way of his own behavior. And so the rabbi is seen in his disciples. Okay? Very common biblical idea. And so Paul is going to do something along these lines too when he has to defend his apostolicity. Because as we know from this text, 2 Corinthians, there were those who were denying that Paul was an apostle. There were those who were saying Paul is not an apostle. Why not? What is the evidences that he is not an apostle? Well, they mention primarily his sufferings. He's shipwrecked, he's thrown into prison, whipped, cast out of synagogues. And so, what is their reasoning? It's very clear what their reasoning is. How can such a man be the apostle of the Lord? Right? Because the Lord is the great king, right? His apostles will speak in flowery tongues. Paul doesn't. And they sure will not be whipped and cast out of synagogues, but they will be received with pomp and splendor. So what in fact Paul does is to say, the marks of my apostolicity is precisely my sufferings. Precisely my sufferings. And in defining his apostolicity by way of his sufferings, he defines at the same time the nature of the lordship of Jesus as that of the cross as well. Because the idea of lordship and apostolicity are mutually interpretive notions. The Lord who sends is imaged in the one who is sent. Okay? And so Paul, being a good rabbi, understands the idea. And so we have already in the call narrative, Acts 9, for example, of Paul, the Lord who appears to him on the Damascus road says to him, or actually we'll say it to Ananias, it is what? Necessary that he should suffer for my name. And this notion of necessity, there's your Greek word, it is necessary. It doesn't mean if he goes out in my name, he's going to have real oppositions. He's really going to have some bad luck. He may even find himself in prison. Well, that's kind of right, too. But this necessity, expressed by this verb dei, this is how God fulfills his intentions. It's the same word then when Jesus says to his disciples in the gospel stories, it is necessary that the Son of Man be handed over and die and be raised again. Same day. Same necessity. It's simply that the apostle has been brought into the Christological activity of the Lord, which is that of the crucifixion. And this is a deeply martyrological notion. The martyr was an apostolic figure. Why? Because the martyr imaged the apostle. No, this interesting statement of Paul. Be imitators of me. He says this every once in a while. Be imitators of me. And then one time he'll say, oh, also of the Lord. Because he is the image of the Lord. You are the image of the Lord by being an image of the apostle. But let's go to this text, 2 Corinthians, because this is where Paul defends his apostolicity. And let's just take a look at what I think is some of the most remarkable language of the New Testament. And I'm not off target here. This is a deeply martyrological passage. Let's just pick up chapter 4, verse 5 or so. And it says, we proclaim not ourselves, but Jesus Christ Kyrios. Right? Jesus Christ the Lord. And so Jesus Christ as Lord is the topic, the subject matter, the content of his apostolic preaching. For the God who spoke, let light shine out of darkness. You can see the language of creation there. This is also the language of revelation. This is also the language of resurrection. Who shone in our hearts, and then you have this heaping up of this kind of revelatory talk unto the illumination of the knowledge of the glory of God in the face of Jesus Christ. Now the word prosopon, here translated face, I suppose in your texts, means that which is seen. Prosopon means that which is seen, a face. That's how you recognize someone. I know Justin Kane because, well, he looks like Justin Kane. And so I know this is not Justin Kane because he has a different prosopon. That which I see is different, right? Pros, towards, what is seen, hopton, right? That which is seen, it's a mask, that which you assume. Pretty soon we're going to Halloween, and Casper the Friendly Ghost will come to my door, and I will know it's Casper the Friendly Ghost because it'll have a white sheet and a smiley face, right? And I will know that that is not, in fact, the Wicked Witch of the North because she comes in black boots and a pointed hat, right? That's prosopon, right? And so, in the face of Jesus Christ then becomes the very image, the very manifestation of this light, which is of the glory of God, right? The glory of God by way of the person of Jesus. That's where the glory of God is. Jesus is the glory of God. The way God manifests himself. The way God is known. Now, verse 7. We have this treasure. What treasure? All the words of verse 6. We have this treasure of the illumination of the knowledge of the glory of God in Jesus Christ. We have this. Where? In earthen vessels, our own bodies. Right? And then in order that the superabundance of the power of God may not be seen to be what? From us. Right? And so now the apostle begins to talk about the character of his own apostolic identity. Okay? What marks him out as an apostle. In every way, we are beaten, but we are never taken down completely. A number of similar such statements in verses 8 and 9. But let's move to verse 10. And 11, which has some really remarkable talk. Now, Paul is speaking of himself as apostle. He's not speaking in the first instance of all Christians, although implicitly he's speaking of all Christians. For always, at all times, we are bearing about in the body the dying of Jesus. Necrosis, the dying of Jesus. The process of being given over into death. Right? Not the death of Jesus, but the dying of Jesus. It's a more active noun form. Okay. Why? To what effect? To what purpose? In order, indeed. Okay, I don't know if you have this in your English, but in the Greek you have this henakai. In order that to be sure, the life, the zoe, the resurrection life, the eschatological life of Jesus may be made visible, phanereo, that means what you can see with the eye, manifested. Right? What you can see with the eye, in order that the life of Jesus may be made manifested, where? In our body. Right? And then in verse 11, it's even starker in the language. For we are always being paradidomethod. Here he picks up actually the language of the Passion account, where Jesus is handed over, paradidomi. We are always being handed over, even though living unto death, for the sake of Jesus, in order that indeed the life of Jesus may be made manifested in our, and I know your English translation says mortal body, right? But the Greek is harsher than that. I often tell my students, if you want to see a mortal flesh, go to the nativity ward, right? There are these little bundles are already on their way to mortality. But if you want to see thmete sarx, okay, which is the Greek here, you have to go to the morgue, right? In our death-ridden flesh, right? And so this is very strong language, but you can see where the life of Jesus is made visible in that which seems to be not life at all. And hence, Paul is reflecting deeply upon the significance of the cross of Jesus. He's not morbid. He's not hoping that he gets the sword to his neck. He's simply saying, I'm an apostle. And if I'm an apostle, I have to, by way of my speech, I preach nothing but Christ crucified, as well as by the manner of my own vocation, which is a deeply fleshly identity, experiential fact, must have the image of the cross. That's what he's saying. Right? And so, not surprisingly then, if you go to verse or chapter 11 is filled with the language of Paul's weaknesses. I will glory in my astheneia, my weaknesses, right? And then he speaks here of these super apostoloi, these super apostles that deny that he is one. Okay? And then, starting with verse 22, chapter 11, are they Hebrews? I am as well. Are they servants of Christ? I am not boasting excessively here beyond myself. And then he has a litany of his sufferings and experiences. Okay, which culminate in the story of him being let down in a basket over the wall of Damascus at night. Right? And these are deeply ironic claims and statements. For when he lists his sufferings here, he adopts a particular literary form, which was known as the res gestae. The res gestae was usually the accounting by the court chronicler or the court poet of all the victories of the king, right? And so if you wanted to extol the majesty of your king, you would recount all the victories. If you've ever been to Rome and you go near the Colosseum, you can see the Roman Forum there. And if you go to the Forum of Trajan, you still have Trajan's column, okay, which depicts, in this case, by way of, not words, but by way of a sculpture all the way up the column, his victories over the Dacians, for example. That's a res gestae in stone. And so, in effect, what Paul is saying, if you want me to recount my victories, here they are, right? And then being let down over the wall at night, that corresponds to what was called the corona muralis, the crown of the wall given to that Roman soldier or soldiers who were the first one to breach the wall of an enemy city. They were given kind of the Purple Heart of that day, if you will. Right? And so in effect what Paul is saying here, if you really want to see that event that shows my soldiery expertise and glory, it was that I was let down in a basket over the wall. Deeply ironic. The powers of God are by way of a different form. And then these famous passages in chapter 12 about the thorn in the flesh. The thorn in the flesh is not epilepsy or some sickness. The thorn in the flesh are the sufferings of the apostle. Christ gives him this thorn in the flesh. And so you have this remarkable echo of Gethsemane. I besought Christ 3 times, right? Just like Jesus did, if it be possible, Father, let this cup pass from me. So what in effect the apostle here is saying is there was 3 times in which I told Jesus, hey, I don't want to be apostle. Take this thorn out of me. To which Jesus says, just as his Father in Gethsemane no doubt had said, my grace suffices. For my power, and here you see that language of culmination again, is perfected, reaches its goal in weakness. Now, there is a good example of where this is not a matter of a moral enterprise. It is a matter of God doing his purposes, reaching his purposes against those which would bring him down, God down. So God is manifested, God is glorified, or God is besmirched in those who bear his name. God can be embarrassed in the world, as we know from Ezekiel. It is not for your sake, tells Ezekiel, to tell the Israelites, that I will call you forth from your land. It's for the glory of my holy name, which they caused to be blasphemed. Why? Because of their sin and idolatry. And so as we shall also see, the martyr represents the instantiation of right worship. That is to say, it is the instantiation of one who loves God with his heart, soul, and mind. And so in its own way, too, the martyr was the image of true man, of true humanity. What the human looks like, true humanity looks like within the context of sin and death. Or, if you want, as the very experiential instantiation of faith. If you ask somebody in the early church, could you tell me the best evidence that Jesus was true man? They would not point to his bones or his hair or his sinew or his skin or anything that suggests physicality as such. They would point to his words, Father, into your hands I commend my life. Because the definition of true man was one who has faith in God. That's the definition of man. And so the whole definition of being true man was a Christological definition. It's very important in our day for in terms of Christian identity. Christian identity in biblical and certainly early Christian understanding has to do with what does humanity actually look like. And so Paul, as Peter would say, if you suffer because you did bad and you endure it, well, you're getting kind of what you deserve. But if you suffer for doing good And later on, Peter will actually say that hand your souls over to he who does good. Right? And the language of doing good is not a moral notion, not in the Bible. It is the idea of bringing to pass that which is the instruments of God for good, by which God does his work. Already in the creation story, God saw and it was good. He's not saying, aha, it is really fine. It is beautiful. It's not an aesthetic claim. It's the claim that that which I have made is the apt instrument for doing my purposes. That's what it means. So there's big issues in play in martyr texts. What does it mean to be truly human? What does it mean to be faithful in the context of sin and death, where sin and death have real power? What does this faithful, real human person look like? What will be his stance or her stance on that day? And then finally, what does it mean for God to be God? What does God finally look like in the world of sin and death? These are really big issues. And so, and this is why maybe I didn't spend enough time on it. I just noted briefly that you can find, Tertullian writes around 200 as an example in his little treatise on the martyr, or to the martyrs. He will adduce examples of classical Greek and Roman heroes. He mentions, for example, one Roman hero who was captured and instead of turning traitor to the Roman Empire, allows his right hand, his sword hand, to be burned in the fire. Because Tertullian knows that the Christian too will very likely, some of them, be put to the torch. So you do have from time to time the employment of these classical heroic images. But those are decidedly the minority. The paradigmatic prototype is the suffering of Jesus and what it meant for that man to die. And so the entire gospel story was in play again. If you read the early Christian martyrdom of Polycarp, and I will refer to it in a moment, I think, unless you people continue to ask me questions, I'm beginning to wonder, why did I write this paper? Anyway, the martyrdom of Polycarp has a lead-in paragraph saying he suffered kataton euangelion, according to the gospel. And it meant that he did not he did not evoke or insist upon his death, but when it came to him, he was faithful to it. Right? And so it even depicts the martyr is asked, Polycarp, bishop of what today would be Izmir, Turkey, then Smyrna, do you want to be nailed to the stake? He's going to be burned alive. Do you want to be nailed, right? Do you want to be, which of course for the writer of the martyr text, it's the nailing of Jesus on the cross that's in play. And the martyr says, no, for he will keep me steadfast. Right? Why? Because Jesus was steadfast. And so the martyr then prays this Eucharistic prayer, which is very likely taken from the Eucharistic prayer of the Church of Smyrna of the 2nd century, and describes, let me be the sweet-smelling bread of your sacrifice. Right? This Eucharistic notion that he's not going to be burned alive. He's not going to be reduced to ashes. What's really going on is that he is going to participate in the Eucharistic loaf, which is the body of Jesus. And so then, does this sound strange to you?
That's powerful.
Yeah, right. The reason I ask is that sometimes it sounds strange to people. I'm not surprised it would sound strange. I didn't mean to pick you out. I just saw you shaking your head and wondering what the heck is going on here.
No, it's
Oh,
shaking my
okay.
head, and that's extremely powerful imagery. I mean,
Yeah.
it's awesome.
Yeah. Well, it's not in many ways common to us. These texts are not known very well.
This same thing happened recently